Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this first fall of 2023 virtual porch with Parents Reconciling Network. My name is Emily Bagwell. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm the resource manager at Reconciling Ministries Network. One of the joys of my job is to work with the Parents Reconciling Network, which is an extension ministry of RMN. And this is a group of parents and loved ones who gather to learn together, to support one another, to learn about advocacy, and just to have a space where we can continue to learn and grow and be reminded that we're all on a journey, and that journey happens alongside others, that we are not alone. And so today we're very thankful and excited to welcome the Trevor Project in the form of Keegan Miller, who will introduce themselves in just a minute here. But first, I just wanted to say a hello, and that we're so grateful that you've taken advantage of this opportunity to come, to listen, to learn. Keegan really is going to be guiding our time today, and we want to give them as much time as possible, but just wanted to say a quick hello and also introduce Lois Ann Murray. Lois Ann, if you'll wave, is our board representative for today, co-hosting. So if you need to chat with us throughout the time, just use that chat function. We'll be watching for questions and curiosities, but we are just so grateful for your presence with us today. And with that, I turn it over to Keegan. If you will introduce yourself and share with us today. We are just grateful for you taking the time to come and share a little bit more about the Trevor Project, and particularly this important topic of crisis intervention, prevention. Y'all have a wealth of resources at the Trevor Project, and we are looking forward to hearing from you today on this topic. Especially, just I want to acknowledge that it is Suicide Intervention and Prevention Month, and so this is why we chose this topic this month. So they're very busy at the Trevor Project. Keegan, I'll let you now share with us. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. I have some slides that I will want to share throughout. So it is so delightful to be with you. My name is Keegan. I use they, them pronouns. I am the interim director of public training here at the Trevor Project. And basically what that means is that I get to do a lot of educating around LGBTQ identities, around suicide prevention and mental health. And we primarily focus on educating adults who interact with LGBTQ young people in one way or another. So that includes all of you. And I'm so grateful again to be here today for this. So throughout, I'm going to talk about a lot of different topics. Mostly we're going to focus on those types of things that are some risk factors for our young people, our protective factors for our young people. That way we know what we can work towards when we're trying to prevent folks from being in crisis, and then how to interact and engage with them when they are in crisis. So if you have questions today, just drop them in the chat as you have them. I will either know that I'm answering them later in the session, or I will answer them live as we go. But please feel free to ask whatever it is that is on your mind. I definitely want to, focus on whatever it is that you want to know today. So the Trevor Project is the leading suicide prevention and crisis intervention org for LGBTQ young people. Our mission is to end LGBTQ youth suicide, and we believe that that is an urgent mission. Now, the way that we do that work is in two different aspects, prevention and intervention. What we're most well known for is our intervention methods, which is our lifeline, chat, and text. You can see on your screen there the variety of ways that folks can reach out to us. Our primary demographic is for folks who are under 24 and who are LGBTQ. That being said, anyone can reach out to us at any point in time if they're in crisis or considering suicide. We want them to have some place to reach out to. They're welcome to reach out to us. The only difference is if they're not LGBTQ, if they're not under 24, we might guide them to additional resources that might be more appropriate for their situation going forward, but we will definitely help them in that moment. We do find that our young people like chat and text a little bit more than Lifeline. As a younger millennial, I can certainly appreciate that. The phone can sometimes be 500 pounds, but texting or chatting seems to be a great function. But no matter how they reach out to us, they're met with trained crisis counselors who are not only trained in how to respond to crisis, but specifically on how to respond to folks who are experiencing issues around their identities. So whether they're exploring their identities, whether they're faced rejection, whether they're, trying to transition, whatever the case might be, those counselors are well aware of those variety of issues that LGBTQ young people are facing. So it makes the conversation a little bit easier than, say, like someone calling the National Lifeline. In addition to that intervention mode, our other youth-facing program is Trevor Space. It's a safe space social networking site for LGBTQ youth. Basically, they can get on, they can talk about their identities, they can talk about the latest Netflix show they watched. It really doesn't matter. It's all about building community and connection. There are message boards, there are spaces for chat, there are spaces for resources. There's all sorts of things that they can kind of get into in there, but it's really about, again, building that community and shared space. Couple of really important things to know about Trevor Space. It is age segregated. So our under 18-year-olds are together and our 18 to 24-year-olds are together, again, trying to maintain some safety there. And then additionally, it is a moderated space. So we have 24/7 moderation happening. We have staff members who are watching and looking for things like bullying, harassment, addressing that if it comes up, but also looking to make sure if anyone's in crisis, that they're getting connected in with our crisis services as quickly as possible. In addition to those that prevention method, we also have our adult suite of resources, which is our research, advocacy, and education teams. Our research team puts out a national survey. They've done so annually for the last 5 years. That survey last year reached over 28,000 LGBTQ young people. We're really proud of our survey and how diverse it is. Just to give you a little flavor, a lot of LGBTQ studies are like 80% white, which is definitely not representative of our community. Our last survey was about 50-50 white versus folks of color. We still have ways to go, but we're getting there, and that's the important thing. We also look at regional diversity, economic diversity, identity diversity, those types of things when we're making sure that our sample is representative of the young people. A lot of the stats that I talk about today comes from that national survey. Our advocacy team works at local, state, and federal levels to advocate for legislation that protects the rights of LGBTQ young people. Unfortunately, right now, that looks like pushing back against a lot of anti-LGBTQ legislation. We saw over 600 anti-LGBTQ bills in 46 states this past year. So it's not even a regional thing anymore. We have to be looking across all of the United States because we're seeing that negative pushback in a lot of places. It's not all bad though. Our advocacy team's also working on some positive stuff, and I always like to focus on that too. Recently, we passed a ban on conversion therapy in Minnesota. We are working on passing non-discrimination through the legislature in Pennsylvania. So there's positive things happening too. It just sometimes gets overshadowed by the negativity that's out there in the world currently. And then we have our education team, which I might be a little biased, is my favorite, where we seek to educate youth serving adults primarily. We do provide a little bit of youth programming, but the vast majority of our programming is focused on training the adults to make sure that they can be safe and affirming allies, that they have the ability to interact when folks are in crisis, those types of things. So I just want to talk a little bit about why we do this work and why it's so important. So when we look at suicide across our country as a whole, we know that it continues to be a growing public health problem. In the last 2 decades, suicide rates have increased by about 35%, making it the 12th leading cause of death for all ages in the United States. So it's a big problem as a collective in the US. But if I focus and I narrow that down to folks who are 10 to 24, so our young people, it's actually the second leading cause of death for that entire age range. The first leading cause of death, if you're wondering, is unintentional injury or accidental death. And if you think about it, we do a lot to prevent that, right? We have like lifeguards and seatbelt laws and helmet wearing campaigns and all sorts of things to try to prevent our young people from dying by accident. We could be doing just as much to work on that second leading cause of death of preventing suicide. So, but again, that's everyone in that age range. If I narrow it down even further and I just look at LGBTQ young people, we know that they're 4 times more likely than their cis and straight peers to seriously consider attempting suicide in the past year. In fact, 41% said that they had seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year on our most recent survey. So if you take that number, 41%, and you take a conservative estimate of how many LGBTQ youth are in the US, that puts us at more than 1.8 million LGBTQ youth seriously considering suicide each and every year. All right. That's why we do this work, and this is why we want to talk about these issues today, is that more than 1.8 million LGBTQ young people. Now, I say all of this, and I don't want us to think that LGBTQ youth are like inherently prone to suicide risk because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, but it's rather that they're placed at a higher risk because of the mistreatment and stigmatization that they're facing. For example, 60% of our young people reported experiencing discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity in the past year. You can imagine experiencing that level of discrimination, not too helpful on one's mental health and well-being. And then when our young people wanted counseling, 56% said they wanted counseling, but were unable to receive that counseling in the past year. There's a lot of reasons for that. They kind of fit in, this is the top 10 on their screen, but they kind of fit into 3 major buckets. The first 2 aren't LGBTQ specific, and I always like to point that out, that this is a universal issue. But that the first bucket is around access to care. So things like, do I have health insurance? Does my health insurance cover mental health care? Is my deductible too high? Do I have to travel a far distance to get to care? Any of those access issues. The second bucket is more around mental health stigma. So fear of discussing mental health concerns or being dismissed or not being taken seriously, any of those types of things. And then the third one is more LGBTQ specific, and it's around how one's identity might interact in a therapeutic space. So, for example, is my therapist going to out me to my parents as being LGBTQ? Or is my therapist even going to understand my identity as an LGBTQ person? That number, by the way, almost doubles when we talk about LGBTQ youth of color, because then the question is, does my therapist understand my identity as an LGBTQ person, as a person of my race, and where those things intersect? So I say all this, and I want us to all like take a deep breath, because it's not all bad. All right. Like, it's not all bad. We also want to look at protective factors. And one of the protective factors that we know is that when LGBTQ youth can identify one accepting adult in their life, it lowers their suicide attempt rate by 40%. All right. One affirming adult lowers it by 40%. So the good news is I'm looking at a screen full of adults who can be that affirming adult, right? Because it doesn't have to be a parent or guardian. It doesn't have to be a teacher. It doesn't have to be any particular adult. It can be any adult in a young person's life. So you have that opportunity. But also, I like to imagine, like, if one adult can make that big of a difference in our young people's lives, think about a community of affirming adults and what that does for them, right? So that's always our goal, is like, how do we build that community around our young people and help lower that suicide risk overall by providing that affirming space. So one of the ways that we can make sure that we are boosting help-seeking behaviors, telling people that it's okay to talk about mental health, really making sure that people know we're there for them, is making sure that we use language that destigmatizes mental health and suicidality, and instead provides an open environment for discussing those types of things. We know language matters. It's inherently relational. It is going to provide either a more or less productive atmosphere for growth and learning and sharing. And so we want to make sure we're using the right words to say that it's okay to talk about mental health and suicide. And we also know that using the appropriate words and choosing those words takes practice. So I just want to highlight a few things that we can avoid saying, and some things that we could like the ways in which we can talk about suicide in a more meaningful way. So over here on your screen, we have things that we don't want to say, things like committed suicide. Now, this is an interesting term, because in our society, committed kind of means like one of 3 different things. Usually when people are thinking about it, it's either committed a sin, committed a crime, or being committed, right? And all three of those things are very negative focused, right? It holds a lot of negative emotion with that term in all three cases. And a lot of, often they're related too, by the way. If we look at the history of laws in our country, there were, at one point, there were many laws on the books that said if you attempted suicide, did not die by suicide, you could actually be brought to court for that. You could be fined, you could be jailed. In a few interesting instances, even the death penalty was on the table, which makes no sense whatsoever, given the circumstance, right? But all of that stems back for, if we look at the history of those laws, actually comes from a religious aspect of this idea that dying by suicide is a sin, and therefore against God. So that's what we were actually punishing in the attempt. So I like to point out that some of those laws are still on the books. We don't actively use those laws anymore, but some of them still exist in certain states, depending on where you live. A really great moment of advocacy if you want to try to help repeal those laws, just so, again, it's not written somewhere, right? But instead of saying committed suicide, what we can say instead is died by suicide, right? It's a fact-based language that doesn't have as much stigma attached to it because of all these other things. Other things like successful versus unsuccessful, failed, any of those words that determine, that basically put a moral judgment on it in some way. We want to avoid those words and instead, again, use fact-based language. Things like lethal attempt, non-lethal attempt, attempted suicide by itself is fine as well. Again, we want to stick with fact-based language. The way that successful and unsuccessful oftentimes shows up in spaces is in policy. So, for example, there were school policies that I once read that said in the case of an unsuccessful attempt of suicide, and then talked about how they would reintegrate that student into the school setting. Of course, they meant well, but what is unsuccessful attempt? It means the person lived, right? So a little contradictory to the wording being used. And then failed attempt, I actually have a great friend of mine who talks about his suicide attempt and how, when he woke up in the hospital, and was kind of dazed and, out of it, the first thing he heard the nurses saying was, "Oh yes, this patient had a failed attempt of suicide." And he said about how heartbroken he was because he already felt like a failure in so many other ways, which is what led him to attempt to take his own life anyway. And then to hear that he was also a failure at that was just crushing to him, right? Not the best way to wake up in a hospital. So again, we just want to be very mindful of the wording we used and think about stigmatizing language that we might be using when talking about mental health or suicide, and eradicate that language from our day-to-day conversations. Once we know how to talk about it a little bit better, we can then dive into the things like risk factors and warning signs and those types of things. So I always want to highlight risk factors for suicide aren't that different for LGBTQ youth versus everyone else. The difference is the disproportionate rate at which LGBTQ youth face these risk factors. So, for example, anyone experiencing a mental health crisis is at a higher risk of suicidality. Unfortunately, LGBTQ young people tend to face higher, more disproportionate rates of mental health issues. So therefore, you're going to see that higher risk factor for them. Things like accessibility to firearms or other lethal means, folks who are experiencing homelessness or unstable housing, family crises, academic pressure. Self-injury is a really important one to be mindful of. Not all self-injury is suicidal. Some of it is actually being used as a coping mechanism. And what we want to do there is look for harm reduction models instead of eliminating it completely, because if someone's using it as a coping mechanism, taking that coping mechanism completely away without replacing it with something else can be very detrimental. So what I mean by that is, like, if someone's self-harming, like maybe they're cutting or burning or something, can they like take a rubber band and snap their wrists instead? Like, does that eliminate all harm? No. But is it much better? Yes. And can still kind of give that same feeling. So we want to look at harm reduction with that. But the big problem is that sometimes non-suicidal self-injury can bleed into spaces of suicidal self-injury, and sometimes unintentionally. So we just want to be really mindful of that. Loss or grief, victimization, history of suicide in the family. I oftentimes get asked about history of suicide in the family, like, is that a biological factor or is that an environmental factor? And the short answer is yes, both. There is some studies out there that show that there's biological trauma that is passed down generationally, and that can like impact people even if they aren't raised in the same household as folks who had similar situations. There's also evidence to show that environmental factors of like someone dying by suicide that's in your direct community, that can have impact and cause contagion as well. So we want to look at both definitions of family here, whether that's in the biological sense or whether that's in the family around a person. The ones here in orange are the ones that we see disproportionate rates of in the LGBTQ community. And if you think about it, a lot of them are kind of connected together, right? Someone might be experiencing a family crisis. Maybe they were rejected by their family. That could come with a sense of loss or grief, right? Loss or grief isn't just limited to death. It's more broad than that. Perhaps they got rejected and they've been kicked out of their home. So now that unstable housing piece comes in, right? So a lot of these can be related in those ways. And really what we're doing when we're looking at risk factors is we're determining where someone's baseline vulnerability sits. So we're looking at risk factors, we're looking at their protective factors. What do they have around them that's going to contribute to either having more protection and lower baseline vulnerability, or extra risk and a higher baseline vulnerability? Because the truth of the matter is that everyone experiences stressors, right? That's part of human life is stressors. But depending on where your baseline vulnerability is will depend on whether or not it just gets really uncomfortable or whether you hit that crisis space, right? So someone can experience the exact same crisis or stressor and instead, hit crisis because their baseline vulnerability was already higher. And as we get to that crisis threshold or go over that crisis threshold, that's when we're going to see things like warning signs start to show up. So warning signs that we want to be mindful of is, first, if someone's talking about killing themselves, we definitely want to pay attention and get them help immediately. But we're humans and we're really smart. And we know that if we talk about suicide, that inevitably people are going to do something about it. So instead, we code our language frequently. So instead, we might talk about feeling hopeless or having no reason to live or being a burden to others, feeling trapped or in unbearable pain. So we want to be mindful of any type of language around that kind of conversation. And if we start to hear those types of things, we really want to check in with that person. Different changes of behavior, whether that's increased use of alcohol or drugs, withdrawing or isolating, changes in sleeping or eating patterns, either direction, more or less, saying goodbye, giving away prized possessions. That one's interesting because we see it in our youngest of folks and our oldest of folks. It's the like, elementary student who got for Christmas that PlayStation, whatever number we're on now, and was really excited and was like, yeah, I got this thing, and then suddenly gives it away to his best friend because he doesn't need it anymore, right? It's a good warning sign of like, hey, what's up with that? We also see that in our older population. It's that person who has never been thoughtful or considering end of life planning, but then suddenly starts telling you, oh, when I die, you should take this thing, or take this now, I'm not going to need it for much longer anyway. We want to pay attention to that as well. And then we also want to look at change of mood, depression, anxiety, loss of interest, humiliation, shame, anger, agitation, any of those things. But one of the ones that people miss a lot is a relief or sudden improvement. And what has happened in that case is someone has made a decision that they're going to end their life, and it's going to happen at a certain time, certain place, in a certain way, whatever. And so all the things that they're feeling right now, all that pain and hurt that they're feeling, they realize that they only have to get to that point in time, and then it'll all go away to them, right? So that can come with a sudden relief. So if you see that person who's been like kind of down and depressed for a while have a sudden flip overnight, it's a good moment to check in and just ask them what's going on, right? And, if they come back and you're like, oh, hey, I just noticed, some changes and wanted to see what's going on in your life. And they're like, oh, last night I won the lottery, or last night my parents told me we're going to Disneyland, right? Okay, there's clearly a reason for them to have that kind of flip of a switch, right? But if they don't have that, push a little further, really find out what's happening and what's going on in their life. Folks will often ask us what are some common crisis concerns that our young people talk to us about on the lines. Things like not fitting into societal gender norms. It's not about their identity, but it's rather societal response to their identity, and how they're expressing that. Rejection, particularly coming out at a younger age, mostly because at a younger age you're still vulnerable to the adults around you, right? You still are like the adults around you are still responsible for you, and so you're not financially stable, you're not able to house yourself, etc. So doing so at a young age provides a little bit more vulnerability in that regard. Folks experiencing LGBTQ related discrimination or victimization, which we talked about a little bit earlier, and then things like developmental stressors that are particular to an LGBTQ lived experience. And what we mean by that is, for example, right now, with all of the like anti-LGBTQ laws, our young people are being told, first of all, we don't believe you actually exist. And if you do exist, we shouldn't be talking about you. You shouldn't have access to healthcare. You shouldn't be able to play sports. You shouldn't, any of these things, right? Non-LGBTQ kids aren't being told that they don't deserve to exist in that way, right? There's a big difference. And this is during a crucial developmental stage of our young people's lives. And so that's a particular stressor that, again, not all young people are facing. And of course, we don't want to just look at warning signs and risk factors. We want to look at protective factors. And we know that when young people have access to affirming homes, schools, community events, online spaces, that they report lower rates of attempting suicide. And when we're affirming gender identity amongst trans and non-binary young people, that's also associated with lower rates of attempting suicide. So we asked our young people, like, what's it helpful for people to know more about in your life, right? Like, if you could educate the people around you about anything, what would it be? And this is, the top of the list here. So just learning about support and acceptance, gender identity, sexual orientation, pronouns, safe spaces, just learning about those things is really helpful to our young people. We also ask them, like, what makes you happy? What brings you joy and strength, right? And it was a fill in the blank. It's one of my favorite things is to go read all of the responses that our young people gave us, but here's a handful of them. And I like to point out that, again, not all of these are LGBTQ specific, but there's oftentimes an LGBTQ component that prevents our young people from accessing these at the same rates as their peers. For example, athletics, right? If folks are trans or non-binary, they're going to have a lot harder time accessing, playing in sports for a variety of reasons. So it's not that athletics and exercise isn't a protective factor equally across the board. It's just that LGBTQ youth are going to have a harder time accessing that. Similarly, right, faith and spirituality, great protective factor for all young people. But how are our LGBTQ young people able to access those spaces, and where can they find faith communities that are supportive of them? So anytime that we're providing access to any of these things, that's going to be a protective factor for our young folks. And again, this is just to kind of show where those different affirming spaces impact our suicide attempts. And you can see when folks have more affirming spaces, their suicide rates are lower across the board. And it can be something as simple as respecting folks' pronouns, right? We asked young people, how many of the people that you live with respect your pronouns? And you can see here, like 50% said none of them. 27% said all, right? And the thing is that when people had their pronouns respected all the time, we saw lower suicide attempt rates than those who did not have their pronouns respected. And here's that stat there. Again, all was the important factor here. It can be things like accessing a gender neutral bathroom, right? Again, we saw lower suicide attempt rates for those who had access to something like a gender neutral bathroom at their school. It's all about providing safe and affirming spaces. That's really what this comes down to, is any of these little ways, these little tiny things that all add up to providing a safe and affirming environment for our young people. And we asked them, what would it look like when all LGBTQ people are accepted? And here's the bigger the bigger the word, the more often it was said. And I like to point out that this tells me that our young people have some hope, right? There's hope in there. We just got to pull it out sometimes. Here's more things that they said, what the world would look like. A lot of these things aren't that hard for us to do now, right? Ask people's pronouns, provide gender neutral bathrooms, mind our own business sometimes, right? Like all of these things can help our young people feel like they're in a world where they're fully accepted. So how you can help, I always like to point out that empathetic listening is like the number one thing. It's what we do on our crisis lines all the time. And you can do that in your day-to-day life. We can, stay with a person, reflect their language, validate and normalize what they're going through, be non-judgmental, which is really hard, particularly when we're dealing with young people, I think. But we can do it. I have faith. Expressed care, concern, encouragement. This also means that we're not avoiding or subject changing when the challenging conversations come up. As humans, we don't like to engage in conversations around hard things. We have to. We need to lean in. We want to avoid interrogation or lecturing. That's not what folks need in those moments. They need an open space to, get things out, get some feedback, those types of things. We want to avoid advice giving. Particularly when folks are in crisis, for multiple reasons. One, it's harder for folks to listen to you when you're just doling out advice. Two, if you give advice that doesn't work out for them, you become an untrusted servant in that point. So we want to avoid advice giving. Now, if someone does specifically ask you, they're like, what would you do? The best thing you can do is give examples of things that have happened in your past, give your experience, use I statements, and talk about what happened as a result of your experience. So, I was in a similar situation to this. This is what I did. This was the result. That allows young people to look at what your experience is, say, yep, that's the result I want, or no, that's not the result I want, and make a choice accordingly, right? So again, if someone asks you for it, then that's the way to do it. But otherwise, focus on giving that person time and space to kind of figure out what's going to work best for them. Avoid bright siding or silver lining a situation. Not helpful in those situations. It feels dismissive. And then we're going to avoid invalidating or trying to change their mind. And I know when we're talking about suicide, that can be really hard for us to conceptualize. But we're ultimately not trying to change their mind from it, but we're trying to get them to see all of the other options that they could choose. And then let them make that choice that's going to work best for them. If someone is in crisis, considering suicide, we want to connect that person to resources and support. We want to accept and listen to that person's feelings, taking them seriously. If they have a plan to attempt, get them help. Do not leave that person alone. Do not, send them about their merry way. Make sure that they're getting handed off to someone else who has more ability to engage with them, whether that's a parent, whether that's a mental health provider, someone else that, again, has a little bit more access to helping them in that case. And then empower. empower them to reach out and get help, whether that's with their own therapist, whether that's connecting them to Trevor Project, whether that's in the National Lifeline, whatever the case might be. Help empower that person to make some choices that are going to be better for them. And then the last thing I want to talk about when someone's in crisis is it's really super important that if you're concerned that someone is considering suicide, that you ask them that question. And the way that we like to ask that question at Trevor is the direct question of, are you thinking about killing yourself? It's a really hard question to ask, but it's super important, because if we ask, like, are you thinking about suicide? That could be a little bit more broad, a little bit more, open-ended. But are you thinking about killing yourself is going to yield one of three answers: yes, no, or maybe. And I always say maybe is yes. So now you don't have to directly ask that question immediately, right? If someone's coming to you with an issue. But if you are concerned, contextualize it and then ask. And you can say something like, you're talking about a lot of things as you're going through right now. That sounds really hard. Sounds like, you're in a lot of pain. I hear you say you can't take it anymore. So I just want to check in. Are you thinking about killing yourself? If they answer yes, ask them a few more questions to see if they have a plan. And then get them connected into the help that they need. If they answer no, then we move on with the conversation, and we just keep engaging with that person, and helping them through whatever tough time that they're dealing with. So just a few things. Some active mental health allyship. Allyship isn't just limited to being an LGBTQ ally or being a racial ally or whatever the case. It's also mental health allyship out there in the world. Be kind, use empathy, check your own biases, respect folks, use inclusive language. That means being mindful of that language that we use when we're talking about suicide and mental health, being mindful of the language we're using when talking about identities, being intentional and thoughtful about the questions we ask and things we say, educating ourselves, know what your local mental health resources are so you can connect people in when and know that before a crisis occurs so you're not looking it up in the moment. And then advocate for change, whether that's making sure that your own spaces have resources for mental health, whether that's calling legislators and having them help make sure that there's funding and inclusive policies for accessible and affordable mental health care, or restricting access to lethal means, or a variety of other ways that we can, mental health parity is a whole nother issue. Lots of ways we can engage in legislative work around mental health allyship. And then with active LGBTQ allyship, providing gender inclusive facilities, encouraging self-advocacy. I always tell people right now there's a lot of negative media around LGBTQ identities. So like when you see that positive LGBTQ story, hit like, share, retweet, send it to a friend, send it to a cousin, whatever the case might be. Get that media out there in the world. Speak out if you see harassment, discrimination, biases, microaggressions, etc. Facilitate inclusive pronoun practices. That means using your own. I saw a lot of people have their pronouns behind their name here on your Zoom. That's awesome. Keep doing that. And then advocate for change, again, within your own work spaces, community environments, those things. And call your legislators. No matter where you are, there's legislation out there that is negatively going to impact LGBTQ young people, and your legislators need to hear from you. Where can you learn more? Check out the trevorproject.org. If you go /research, that will get you to our national survey, our monthly research briefs, our peer-reviewed articles, all of that kind of stuff. And /resources will get you to a bunch of different resources for LGBTQ youth and their allies. Everything from our coming out handbook to our guide to being an ally to trans and non-binary youth. All sorts of resources to help folks learn and grow. And that is it for me. Also, you can feel free to reach out to me at any point in time to ask questions, to get connected into resources, to do trainings with your community organizations, any of those things. Always happy to help.
Thank you so much, Keegan. We really appreciate it. What just a great, not just overview. I mean, there was depth to what you shared and presented, but also a number of resources that come behind it to help continue to support and educate us around mental health issues, but particularly suicide prevention and intervention. Before Keegan does, they have a hard stop today, and so I want to respect their time. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to put in the chat for us to know are in front of us for the rest of our time together today? Please feel free to utilize the chat. But before Keegan has to go, let's give them a big a Zoom applause, which I think a good way is to do just twinkle hands for those who are on video. Thank you, Keegan, for all the work that you do. At RMN, we don't have the capacity to provide everything that we wish we could, and so on our website we refer people directly to the Trevor Project specifically for suicide prevention or intervention. Are so grateful for partners like the Trevor Project and the work that you all are doing on a national basis on all the different levels, advocacy, education, prevention. So thank you for sharing with us today. You certainly have guided us to a number of other resources. We're very grateful. So thank you, Keegan, for your presentation and for being with us. And we look forward to a continuing partnership as well. Keegan, I hope it's okay that I share this. You share with me that you attend a United Methodist Church, and so I have that connection with this community particularly, which I was like, yay, that's exciting. So we're grateful for you and your journey and your leadership, particularly when it comes to the educational realm. We'll see you soon. All right, folks. Well, thank you so much for being here today. Unless anybody has any questions that they want to put in the chat, that has been our presentation and our topic. I will just say that we host these virtual porches every month. Typically, they are on the second Tuesday at noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. October is a little bit different because we have our national convocation being hosted in Charlotte, North Carolina, the week we would be normally doing this. And so we're going to do it the following week. And that's going to be a good opportunity for you to hear about some of the good learnings from convocation. So we look forward to being able to share in this virtual space. If you have any curiosities about convocation, you can go online to rmnnetwork.org and learn more about what convocation is and who will be speaking, etc. But that's in October. Would love to see some of you there. I think that there are some folks that are registered, which is great. And then we will have a time in November and December. We're looking forward to hearing from the Human Rights Campaign, and also circling back with the Mama Bears. So we have lots of exciting things this fall as far as topics. As always, we'd love to hear what's on your mind, what you have need of, how we can be a help and a resource to you and your community and those who you journey with. So don't hesitate to ever reach out. You can email us at resources@rmnetwork.org or to me directly, Emily@rmnetwork.org. Grateful for your presence today. We thank you for spending this time. We hope that you learned something. If you are in need of help yourself, know that this is a good outlet and a resource for you to get connected with resources in your area. Just remember that you're not alone. We are here with you, for you, to journey alongside you. And we will continue this conversation about mental health. There are many different capacities that we can address mental health, and we want to do that together in a number of ways. So stay tuned, pay attention to the calendar as it comes out, and thank you for joining us this day. Go in peace and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.